Christianity started out with a handful of followers and some female supporters, but exploded to include the emperor of the Roman Empire. What was it about Christianity that made conversion such a compelling choice for so many polytheistic people? I've been here all summer and I'm going back to teach because it's my day job, and it's a very different rhythm, but I just like it all. It's hard to change gears from a summer of research and writing to going back into teaching because the day job involves more than just showing up in a classroom and teaching. It's a lot of administrative stuff and it's doing grunt work, but it's also trying to get excited again about topics. When this goes out, the kids are still having fun and making a lot of noise and mess as children should during the summer holidays. At the end of August, I'll be going to Canada with my husband to speak at a conference on atheism. I'm not 100% sure where we'll be going exactly, but it'll be north of you. Christianity took over the Roman Empire in the early days, and most people were pagan. Christians were the new kids, and their insistence that their God was the only God wasn't normal. Even Jews were not insistent that their God was the only God, and even those who said that weren't interested in anybody else joining them in worship of this God. So it was different with Christians, and henotheism was a way of thinking that helped some pagans convert to Christianity. Henotheism is a kind of religiosity that is similar to monotheism but with a distinctive difference, so it was found in parts of Judaism and the Greek and Roman worlds. Judaism starts out as henotheistic when the first commandment says you shall have no other gods before me. It's assuming there are other gods but none of them are superior or to be worshipped instead of Yahweh. Within Judaism and within the pagan world, there was a worship of a god that was sometimes called the hypsistos theos, which means in Greek means the highest god, and people who knew about these other religions believed that there was only one God. Early Christianity was very much a missionary religion, and modern Christianity still is. The idea of evangelism was something that would have been familiar to pagans in the Roman world, but the idea of evangelizing for your God was something else. The pagan religions were polytheistic and supported the worship of many gods, so the only place where you really get something like conversion is in the realm of philosophy. Philosophers in antiquity took various stands and were in different schools of thought. They maligned each other and attacked each other, but they tried to get converts to their philosophical views. The Christians are kind of like the philosophers because they're insisting you've got to live a Christian life so that you'll have an afterlife, a good afterlife. I see. Thank you for your question, and I want to be clear that I got this idea from a very important scholar of early Christianity, Ramsay MacMullen. He argued that Christian exclusivity was really important because in pagan religions there was no idea that you had to worship a single god, and when you have a religion that believes in trying to convert people to its view, it makes a lot of difference. Combination of evangelism and exclusivity had a very powerful effect, and as people came to the Christian faith, they were leaving all the other faiths. If you become Christian, you stop being pagan, and MacMullen makes a deal of this. Then if you go into a town and you both give a presentation and you're equally convincing, then Christianity gains 50 converts and paganism loses 50 people and gains no one. The reality is that you don't have to convince half of them, you just have to convince a couple of them, and then suddenly there are no pagans left with this exclusivity of it must have seemed very strange to a pagan audience. When the numbers are taken off, you get these intellectuals who are pagan who really find Christianity offensive. They say there's no one way to the divine. Christianity in the first 400 years didn't have many missionaries. Paul was one, and he mentions some other Cephas, but between Paul and the Emperor Constantine you can count the number of people who are missionaries on one hand in the entire Roman Empire. There were no Billy Graham rallies, and probably not even people getting up on their soapbox and preaching in the public forum. The mechanics of how word of mouth spreads is really pretty interesting. It's one person telling another and converting them over time. It's personal connections in conversation, and scholars have devised this understanding of how that can work by network theory. The Roman world had extended families, and it wasn't just a nuclear family. You lived with your parents, grandparents, children, servants, and slaves, and the household would be a unit, and the city was organized as a big family. The head honcho of the family was called the paterfamilias. If the Apostle Paul converted a man in Corinth who had a family, the entire family would become Christian, because the head of the family was a Christian, and over time the wife would join in too, and so on. Scholars have wrestled with the question of what was it about Christianity that made it succeed for a very long time. The old view was that paganism was a bankrupt set of religions and that Christianity filled the void left by the failure of paganism. One variation of that is that Christianity was just obviously superior, that it was better to have one God than a bunch of gods, and so on. Pagan religions were thriving in the period of Christianity, and most people had no problem with their religion. Christianity provided a way for lower-class people to come together and celebrate their lives, and provided help for those in need in the community. The idea is that the rich got along fine just by themselves, and in the ancient world the rich mainly stuck to themselves, but in the Christian communities they came together and took care of the poor and provided what people needed for the homeless and the hungry, and so people joined the church. It seems appealing, but in my book The Triumph of Christianity I try to explain why that probably isn't the reason that Christianity succeeded. For one thing, converts never talk about the benefits within the community, and before Constantine most of the Christian communities were closed. Rodney Stark argued that Christianity succeeded because they had superior healthcare, but I don't think that's true. Studies have shown that simple nursing increases survival rates of when people are deathly ill. In the early Christian sources we're told that when a big plague would come along, Christians would go in to help the pagans, and so by the end of the plague there were more Christians. There's no way the theory works, because when the Christians go in to take care of the sick people they get the disease, and so the Christians were dying off more, they weren't dying off less. It has to do with why people worship the gods in the first place. Christians were not simply inventing a new religion that was nothing like anything anybody had heard before. There were similarities between Christianity and other religions, and the biggest similarity is, why are you worshiping the gods? In the pagan world, people worshipped gods by sacrificing to them and giving them offerings, and they did this so that the gods would help them in their situations. Pagans worship powerful gods, and when a new religion comes along that argues that its god is more powerful than all the other gods put together, they will worship that god. This is what Christians are doing by word of mouth. The power of God, the Christian beliefs in the afterlife, and the idea of a fire and brimstone sermon all play a role in the growth of Christianity, and almost every ancient conversion account is because the Christians can do miracles. Christians started preaching heaven and hell because they believed that God was more powerful than pagans, and that if you don't believe in him you're going to face torment in the afterlife. So they created the sense that you've got to escape heaven and hell even among people who've never even heard of them. The last question I had before we moved on: how many conversion accounts do we have from antiquity? Well, we don't have millions of them, but we have some, and in a variety of texts going back to the New Testament. When people convert in the book of Acts, it's always by doing a miracle. Even in writers who are very intelligent, highly educated, sensible writers tell us it's because of miracles, so I think there are very few conversion accounts that are historical in nature. Bart's Weekly Update is where we get to catch up on all the latest about Dr. Ehrman's book releases, speaking engagements, and online course launches. Bart Ehrman's free webinar, Did Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John Actually Write? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John will answer some of the most intriguing questions surrounding the Gospels' authorship, such as why did early Christians say the Gospels were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John if they're anonymous? What's the best evidence? This conference is going to be great because it's a Bible conference by scholars given to non-scholars, and because the scholars know how to communicate to regular old folk. Dale Allison, emeritus now from Princeton Theological Seminar, will be speaking. He wrote a book about how Jesus is being portrayed by Old Testament allusions in Matthew as somebody like Moses. One of my favorite things about studying ancient literature is looking at how motifs and themes are interwoven through new texts. Early Christian authors knew the Hebrew Bible and used it in ways you wouldn't even notice. Robin Walsh is also going to be doing a presentation, and she's written a book on understanding the Gospels as literature within the Greek and Roman worlds that came out a few years ago. Her presentation is entitled From Illiteracy to Inspiration: Unveiling the Minds Behind the Gospels. She's very sharp and knows a lot, so I'm really looking forward to her presentation.